Hello and welcome back. In this video we are going to be working on adding some images to our website. So when you're working with images, it's important to notice a few things. One is the color space of your image. The second is the resolution of your images. So because we're working in a digital space, all of our images must be set to an RGB color mode. If it's an image that is set to CMYK, it must be converted to RGB. This can be done with multiple different types of software. In this video series, I'm going to be working with Adobe Photoshop to edit all of my images and prepare them for the web. So I have an example of two images that I'm going to be pulling up and working with to add to my website, and both of these images were found off of Unsplash, which has royalty-free images. So when I downloaded these off of Unsplash and then opened them up in Photoshop, I can first check the color space. So to check the color space of an image within Photoshop, you're going to go to Image and then Mode. And then I can see that RGB is checked. So that lets me know that this is the correct color space of RGB. The next thing I want to check is how big is this image. So I'm going to go to Image Size. And like most images downloaded from Unsplash, this is a very large image. The size of this image is 6,000 pixels by 4,000 pixels at a resolution of 72 dpi. So when working in web, all images should be set to 72 dpi, even for high definition devices. That is a standard for a screen. Print is 300 dpi. But 72 is correct. However, I want to make this smaller. If I were to upload this image to my site, it's very large. It's currently sitting at 68.7 megabytes. That is huge. That's going to take a lot of downloading time. If someone happens to be on their phone, they don't have necessarily great Wi-Fi or great connection, it's going to take forever to download. Google also will penalize you for large or long loading times for a site. So if you've got a lot of images that take a long time to load, you're going to get penalized by search engines. So we want to size this down. So I want to be mindful of how big this is going to be. So I'm going to just drop it to really, a lot of your standard sizes won't need much more than 1800 pixels wide. And even that's pretty generous for something like a hero image. So let's take a look at what happens when I drop this to 1800 pixels. I'll hit OK, and that's dropped down. So please note, when you're working in Photoshop, if you are eliminating size, you cannot go back up. So if I save this out and close the image, once I reopen it in Photoshop, I cannot get back that amount of resolution. It's gone. So it's important to rename your images. So if you've got an original file that you have from a camera, from a photographer, that you keep that original someplace else, and that what you're editing to for your website will go into your final images folder and be named appropriately so that you understand that this is sized for web. So when I eliminated that, this is still a fairly clean image. It's helpful to note in Photoshop it says 100% here. I'm viewing this currently at 100% the resolution. So that still looks pretty nice at that size. It's still fairly large, although I've eliminated a lot of file size from this. I've gone from 50 something down to 6 megabytes. And that's much smaller. However, that's still pretty large. This would be relatively appropriate for a hero size image. However, I know I don't want this image to be a large hero image, so I'm going to size it down a little bit smaller. But rather going to image size, I also want to change the general aspect ratio of this image. So because I want to make this a square, right now it's a little bit of a horizontal rectangle, I want to make it a square picture because I'm also going to work with this little cheesecake image, and I want them to both be the same size square. So how do I do that? Well, there's a couple ways I can do it. One, I can use the crop tool and set it to a 1:1 square ratio. That looks pretty interesting. That's set at that 1:1. I can move this around a little bit. Oops. and move that image in there if I want to adjust that crop, but realize it's going to that size for the bread. That's not too bad. So I can crop this. I could just hit enter. Now that image has been cropped to that. What I like to do, because it gives me a little more flexibility than the crop tool, let's jump back in my history palette here, undo that, is I'm actually going to edit this from the artboard itself. So I'm going to open up my layers panel, and I'm going to unlock that background. This basically untethers the image from its respective artboard. Now I'm going to change the canvas size of this. So I'm going to go to image, canvas size, and I can now change the pixel dimensions. So right now it was 1800 by 1200. If I say, you know what, let's go ahead and make this 800 by 800, and it's hit OK, it's going to say, hey, that new canvas size is smaller, so it's going to crop in on that. And I say, that's okay, proceed. What I can do is that my image is still here. It's the artboard that has changed size. So now I can kind of edit that picture within this square frame. So I can play around with that crop a little bit more rather than some of that automatic crop tool. So I can do edit, transform, free transform, that's what I'd like to do. And then if I hold down shift, depending on your version of Photoshop, it may be shift or not holding down shift to constrain proportions here, because I don't want to warp my image. It's very important that you never warp your images. You don't stretch, you don't squish. They should always stay the same so they don't look weird, especially if you're working with images of people. So I'm going to crop that. That looks great. I'm going to hit enter. And now I can see that because I've dropped this, it's now 1.83 megabytes. That's a severe reduction in loading time. That's 60 times faster almost than what my original image that I started from. So that's looking pretty good. Now I want to do the same thing to my cheesecake picture because I want them to be the same size. I want it to be that 800 by 800. So again, if I check this, if I forgot how big it is, I can go to image size. It is 800 pixels by 800 pixels at 72 dpi. That's perfect. That is now an appropriate size for the web. So let's do the same thing for our really lovely cheesecake here as well. So I can double check and see. Let's double check. Yep, that's RGB color. Let's go ahead and change the size of this. And I don't even really need to change it from here if I don't want to. I can drop it because it's a fairly large image. Drop it down to 1800 by 1200. It's a little smaller. Untether it from the background within my layers panel. Zoom in just so I can see a little bit better what I'm working with. And I'm going to go to image, canvas size, and change that to being 800 by 800. The reason I'm making them the same is because I'm going to have them sit near each other, and I want them to be the same size, so that way when I style my text to go with them, everything is lining up. It's easier to kind of size these in Photoshop the way that I would like them rather than sizing them with code. It's also important to note that if I was not sizing these down and I was just using HTML to size my image, that entire image would load. So my large 6,000 pixel image, even if I just typed in width and height for my image in my HTML to make it smaller, that entire image is loading and then having to shrink with the code. So that is what delays loading. Even if you shrink it down and say, no, I only want it to be a couple hundred pixels, but you didn't size the original image source down, it's all gonna load, and that's gonna slow your image loading time. All right, so I've now sized my cheesecake picture here to being 800 pixels by 800 pixels. That's about the same size. Let's go ahead and get these out of Photoshop and into my website. So I can look at some of the options for exporting for web out of Photoshop. So there's a few that I can do. We can go to File, Export, quick export is a PNG. Because these are photos, I don't necessarily want to export them as a PNG. PNG stands for Portable Network Graphic, and I don't, PNGs can be a little larger than a JPEG file size. Part of the reason why is because they can handle transparency. My images that I'm working with right now aren't transparent, nor do I need transparency, so I don't really need some of that. I'd like to save these as JPEGs. Why? Because they're photographs. And JPEG stands for Joint Photography Expert Group. So JPEGs as a file type were developed for photographs. So generally when you have a full color photograph like this, it works very well as a JPEG. So I'm going to hit Save for Web, which eventually may go away in Photoshop, but I still really enjoy it as an option. And from there I can select JPEG as my file type. Now, because I'm concerned with file sizes, I can use this really handy feature here called 2up or 4up, which allows me to preview my image at different resolutions. So just because I've set this to 800 by 800, I can actually still reduce the quality further of this image as a JPEG. So I see this one is the original that's coming in at 2.44. This JPEG is at 80% quality, and I can see that it's dropping to 157 kilobytes. Ooh, that's a lot smaller. That's very fast. This is at 40% quality, and it's dropping even further to 40 kilobytes, and then 20% quality is at 30 kilobytes. So I can kind of preview these, and I want to ensure that my image, while I'm sizing this, is not losing. I don't want it to get too small that I'm starting to lose the detail or it's starting to look pixelated. This is the designer's job, is to ensure that whatever I'm saving this at, that it looks still is previewing very nicely, not getting pixelated. So once I start to really lose the quality, you can see on this 20% quality, I'm really starting to lose. This is really starting to get kind of chunky around here, as compared to the details in this original one. You're not seeing as many pixels pop out. Because this is kind of small at 80% quality, I think I want to see it at 100% and really see the difference in how big that image is. So I can see that bumps it up to 300 kilobytes. That's still a very small file. So I think I'm going to go ahead and keep it at that maximum, because it's still going to be very quick loading, but I really don't want to get down this low where I'm starting to lose that quality. So when I export out of here, I'm just going to make sure that 100% is selected, and I'm going to hit save. And now I'm going to save this into my folder that I'm working in. And they're right into my images folder. So inside your root folder, you should have your images folder that you're going to be working in. And I want to eliminate, all of this came from Unsplash for an image name. It's important whenever you are naming your image files that they are descriptive to what it is of. So I don't want to just say cake or something. That really doesn't help when it comes to search engine optimization. While it is sort of descriptive, I guess the worst thing you could call it would be like IMG 064. That really doesn't tell me anything about this picture. So if it's something that came off of your camera and it just had a generic image name, you want to name it something mildly descriptive so it matches what your picture is of. But again, you don't want to be too detailed because it is an image name. So I'm just going to call this, it looks like a caramel cheesecake to me. So I'm going to call it caramel underscore cheesecake. Again, you never want to have spaces in your file names. Anytime you would have a space, underscore is a common convention for that. Spaces in your file names is going to cause broken links when you move your website to a server. It'll cause your images to not load. So now I've got it called caramel cheesecake, JPEG. You may also want to, if you are keeping track, if you've got multiple images named similarly, or if you're saying something is a lower res or a higher res, you can do things like low res. That lets me know this is a low res image. it's not a high resolution, or it's saved for web. You could even have a web or a mobile version if you're adjusting your images in that way. You want to do yourself a solid and make sure that you're understanding that these images have, or even something like sized, whatever your naming convention, so you understand that this has been sized for web. So I might just call this web, and I'm going to hit save, and that image is now saved. I'm going to do that same process with this. I'm going to call that a caprese sandwich. I'm going to go File, Export, Save for Web, and I'm going to save it as a JPEG at 100%. I want to show you one other way that you can get this done. Now that I know I want to save this as a JPEG 100% quality, I can simply do a file, save a copy. This is slightly different in the more updated versions of Photoshop. So I'm going to locate my folder here. And I'm going to name it what it is. And I'm going to have the format set to be JPEG. And when I hit save, this is going to pop me up with this little dialog box option. And this is the same as that save for web, where I could select the percentage of quality. So 8 stands for 80% quality. If I scaled it down further, 60, 50, 40, 20. I want it to be 100%, so I'm going to knock it all the way up to 12. That's 100% quality. I will hit OK, and that's saved. Now let's jump into our coding and pop these images in. All right, so now we're back into our website. So I want to add those images of the food into my catering section. So I'm going to navigate to where those sit in my code. So I see my catering, I see my little paragraph. Then I'm going to create a little space underneath, and I'm going to bring in the image. So to bring in an image, I'm going to just type in my IMG, which stands for image, SRC, which stands for source, and I'm going to locate my images folder. And then inside there, I'm going to find that sandwich, and I'm going to close that tag. And I see that there is the picture of my sandwich. So now I want to add in what's called an alt tag. So inside my image tag, I need to add an alt tag. So what an alt tag does is that if for whatever reason my image fails to load, it will give me some alternative text. That's ALT stands for alternative text. Every image you put in, unless it's simply there for decorative purposes, should have an alt tag. And these alt texts will describe what the image is to someone who may be using a screen reader or other assistive technologies. Also, if it fails to load, it is also how search engines see images. A search engine can't see what this is a picture of. It is my job as the designer to describe it to the search engine. So I can say caprese sandwich with fresh tomato, mozzarella, basil, and on whole grain bread. That sounds good. So that's just a description of what, not bread. There we go. So that's just a nice description of what that picture is of. So if it fails to load, or if someone was searching a caprese sandwich near me, and this is now on my site as not only maybe something that I will pull up, or catering caprese sandwich, something to that effect, this is going to pull up higher in a search engine. So it's important to always add those alt tags. They're not difficult to do, and you want to add a descriptive alt tag that really describes image to somebody who could not see it, because again, Google can't see it. It's only going by what you're saying. So if I just said sandwich, that could be anything. What I wrote really describes what I'm seeing for the user. Great, let's pop in our next image. So below that I'm going to type in my next image, SRC, find my images folder, and then I'm going to find that caramel cheesecake, and then I'm going to add in my alt tag while I'm still working here, and I'm going to write caramel cheese cake with cookie crust. I'm making this up. I didn't take those pictures. I think that sounds fairly descriptive. Yeah. That sounds pretty good. That kind of seems like it would match up with what a user is seeing. So that's a way to get those images into our website. Now our next step is going to be styling these. So now that I have both of my images in here, I want to style them a little bit. I want them to sit side by side. Right now they're sitting very tall. They're taking up the whole width of this. And I want them to be a little smaller here and sit 2 by 2. So to do that with these images without doing any terribly fancy code, there's a lot of ways you can have images sit by side and start doing some column designs. We're going to do your basic floats and clears with these. So I'm going to add some inline styling to both of my images because I don't want these to apply to every single image on the page, just these 2 images. So for my bread here, I want it to float to the left, so I'm going to write in a style tag, and I'm going to say float left. And I'm going to set the width to 49%. And then I'm going to kind of do the same thing except for on my second image, except it's going to float right. So I'm going to write a style of float right, and the width of 49%. And the reason I did 49, you can do 50. The reason I did 49 is I want a little bit of a gutter in here, this little bit of space in between. If I set it exactly to 50, they kind of smudge together so they touch each other, which is also a look that maybe you would like in your site. So that's what 50 and 50 look like together. I like a little bit of breathing room in between. I like a little bit of that, what's called a gutter in between. So I'm going to set it to 49 and 49. That way they're the exact same size. You can see how they're sitting next to each other really nicely. So that's at 49 and 49. You never want to go over 100% when you're having the images go side by side like this. The reason being is over 100%, it's going to move down to the next line. So those are looking pretty good, and we did percentages again because that makes it responsive. You see, as I adjust, my images will adjust as well. So the last issue I need to get rid of is location and hours. Because I have these floats on these images, that next thing here is floating upwards. So I need to actually set a style to that one as well. I'm going to do inline because I don't want it to apply to every other H2. So I'm going to set in a style of clear both, and I'm going to set a padding top of 25 pixels just to put down a little bit. And then you can see that now the location and hours is not running into my images as I scale this up and down, and that looks much better. So an additional style I can do to these images, there's lots of styles I can add to them, but a common one would be to round the corners. So if I said I wanted to have a little bit of a rounded corner on either of these, I can just set a border radius, and I can set that to a pixel dimension. So something like 15 pixels is going to give me a slight rounding. You can see that's given me a slight rounding. If I want a lot more rounding, I can add more pixels, and you see that makes a greater rounding. If you wanted to have a perfect circle, you can make it be 50%, and that will turn a square image into a circle. If you had a rectangular image, it's going to make it an oval, but setting it to that percentage would make it a circle. I personally don't really want circles for both of these, so I'm going to go ahead and take it off of that percent and give it a nice light rounding at 15 pixels. I think that gives a little bit more style to these, a little friendlier looking. So I'm going to add the same thing onto this image as well.